Dialogs and modals aren't anything new, where we have a lot of existing libraries and solutions to easily drop in a button onto a page and pop up a more focused UI to allow some kind of action to be performed. But what is new, or what's relatively new, is this dialog element, where if I wanted to add a modal to my page, where if I click an image, it expands to the full size, I no longer have to drop in a library for that. I can now just use the dialog element with a little bit of JavaScript for interaction to easily add one of those to my page. So let's see how we can do that inside of a React app. So I started this Next.js app that allows me to easily dump some images in a Cloudinary account and get a public link where I can show all those images in a nice gallery. Now in this gallery, I'm dynamically cropping these images to be a square so that it looks really nice as I'm kind of scrolling through. But what I want to do is when somebody actually tries to click one of these images, I want to expand and show the full image in a nice little modal. Now, do I grab a library for that? No, I'm just going to reach for the dialog element. Now jumping into the code, I'm not really doing anything special here. I have this gallery component where I'm passing through an array of Cloudinary resources or asset objects where we can see that I'm looping through each and every one of them. I'm displaying on the page. And the only thing that I'm doing that's slightly different is I'm dynamically cropping them so that they can all be a square rather than the full size and have different shapes and sizes. So now what I want to happen is when somebody clicks on one of these images, I now want to pop it up so that I can show the full size of that image. So let's just go ahead and get started with our dialog modal. So I'm going to first add a dialog element to the page, and let's just add my awesome modal where I'm going to indent that. Now, before we even jump into any JavaScript, one interesting thing to point out is we can actually use HTML only for this dialog, where we can see this example here. We have this open attribute that we can add to the dialog that will immediately open it when the page loads. Now, this might be useful if you're doing server-side rendering or something like that, but we can see that we have a form element inside that will allow us to then close that. Now, just to kind of show how this works, by default, we're not going to be able to see that dialog element, but let's just go ahead and add that open attribute. And if we open up the browser, we can see our overlay of my awesome modal. And by no means is this perfect, but it's a good start for getting in that right direction. Now, we're not going to use the HTML only method to do this. We're going to actually just use some JavaScript for this. So I'm going to go ahead and first get rid of that open attribute. But what we want to do is we want to set this dialog up so that we can access the ref of it, so that we can dynamically use the methods associated with that DOM node and then trigger the modal to be open and then later closed. So at the top of the page, I'm going to import useRef from React. And then inside of my component, I'm going to say constant dialog ref equals use ref. And one important thing to note is now that we're going to be using refs and client-side capabilities, we do need to importantly add use client to the top. Now, you could probably abstract this in a way that we don't need to make this entire gallery a server component, but I'm going to leave that for something that you can try. But for now, I'm just going to opt this into a client component so that we can keep moving along. But then I'm going to take this dialog ref and I'm going to use it to set the prop of ref on that dialog. Now, as we can see, TypeScript is yelling at us, so we got to make sure that we actually type this ref out as HTML dialog element or null, and then make sure we pass in that null. Now, as it stands, nothing's ever going to happen with this because we're not invoking it in any way. So let's change that. If we scroll down to our image, I'm going to wrap this with a button element where I'm going to go ahead and indent that. But on that button, I'm going to add my on click handler where whenever that's clicked, I'm going to go ahead and fire dialog ref.current. I'm going to hide myself and I'm going to say show modal. And heading back into the browser, if I go ahead and click on one of the images, we can see that I now get my modal popped up. And just so you know, before you try to refresh the page, you can hit the escape key in order to get rid of it. We'll see how later we can add additional options, but that's how you can get rid of it. But if I click any of those images, I'm able to pop up my modal. Now, just as a quick note, our use case is going to be to show our full size image in here, but you can really use it for any kind of content. It can be a form like we saw on ShadCN, or it can be something completely different, maybe an ad for 10% off your first purchase. But either way, you can use your modal to shape it however you want with your content inside. But back to our use case, we ultimately want to show the image inside the modal, where here we can see that this dialog element is outside of our loop of elements, where technically speaking, we could probably just nest this inside, add the image inside there, but then we would have all those different dialog elements and we couldn't do more dynamic things in the future. So I'm going to retain it outside of the element. So what that means, we're going to now store the image that we select in state so that we can dynamically render the content of the dialog. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and import use state from React, and I'm going to create a new instance of state for active image, set active image, and that's going to be use state. And then I'm going to type that out, and that's going to be a cloudinary resource that, let's see, am I importing it? I'm already importing it from my type system. Now, of course, the type here is probably going to be relevant to whatever kind of content that you're adding or whatever type of asset that you're storing. This is just specifically how I'm storing my assets right now. But now scrolling down to where we have our button click, instead of showing the modal there, I want to set my active image as my resource. So if I scroll up and let's just go ahead and log this out to make sure that it's working properly, we can see that if I start to click around, we can see that my active images is changing based off of the image that I'm clicking. So now let's use that to dynamically render that image inside of our dialog. So I'm going to go ahead and just first copy this CLD image components, since we can just reuse that. I'm going to get rid of the crop because we don't need that. I'm also going to get rid of the sizes so we can just show the full thing. And then we can say we want to use the active images public ID. Now the active image might not exist. So let's go ahead and wrap that to make TypeScript happy, where we know that if the dialog is showing that it is going to exist, but let's just keep it how it is, where now if that active image exists, we're going to render that CLD image with our active image size. Now, importantly, we also need to show the correct width and height, not that square size. So I'm going to say in my cloudinary resource, I'm storing that width and height. So I'm going to add the active image width and the active image height. So heading back to the browser, if I try to click on something, nothing's happening. But if we remember, we removed that show modal method. So now we need to re-implement that. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to use a use effect hook and use the active image as a dependency. So meaning I'm going to watch for changes to that value. So whenever it changes, I'm going to pop open that dialog so that I can now show it. But if there isn't an active image, we're going to assume that there's no dialog being shown and basically just do nothing. So starting off, I'm going to import my use effect hook. And then inside of the component, the top of the component, I'm going to add my new use effect and again, add as a dependency my active image. Now, like I said, if we don't have an active image, I just want to do nothing. But if we do have an active image, I want to take my dialog ref.current and I'm going to again invoke that show modal with a capital M, that show modal method. Heading back to the browser, if I click one of the images, we can see that it popped up and I have my beautiful modal. So we're all done, right? Well, not quite. Let's see what else we can do to kind of smooth over this experience. We can customize the UI a little bit and really create a good dynamic modal experience that we would expect from a modern website. So starting off, you might not notice this depending on the image that you use, but if we open a large image, we'll notice that it has a little bit of scrollability to it. Where if I open up this other image that's really big, we can see that there's a lot of room to scroll here. So the first issue is we want to make sure that we're containing the size of this so that somebody doesn't have to scroll and we can show the full image within the bounds of the actual browser window. In order to do this, I'm going to create a wrapper div, or rather inner div, inside of the dialog element that wraps our image so that I can set those bounds. So first I'm going to add my div element. And then on that div, I'm going to set a max W of a custom 90 viewport height, or viewport width rather, and a max height of 90 viewport height. Now alone, that doesn't really do much. It might add a little bit of extra padding on the side just so that it's not taking up so much room in the browser. It gives a little bit more context in the background. But first of all, that's going to set our bounds for us. But next, I want that modal to retain a certain shape or aspect ratio, and I want that to be dynamic based off of the active image. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to add a style prop to this, where inside I'm going to add a aspect ratio property, and the value of that is going to be driven by the dynamic value of our active image. So I'm going to say active image, and just to make sure that it exists, and it's going to be active image width divided by active image height. So heading to the browser to try this again, if I click on an image, I don't have a scroll, but that was a wide one. If I click on a square one, I don't have any scroll. We can see the scroll in the background. We'll handle that later. If I click on this other image that we knew had a really bad scroll, we can see that it now shows the full thing, and I don't have any kind of scrollability within the container of that modal. Now, the next issue is when we have that modal open, I don't like how light the background is. I feel like the background is super distracting and I want to add more focus to the image itself. So how do we customize that backdrop? The way that we're going to access the backdrop is through a pseudo element, where that pseudo element is going to be backdrop associated to our dialog element. So let's add a class name where that's going to be backdrop, and or backdrop, where we're going to set a BG of black, where I want mine to be based on black in this case, and I'm going to set an opacity of 85%. So here we're setting the pseudo element of backdrop, and we're setting it to a background of black with an opacity of 85%. And noticing I had trouble spelling it, but also this needs to be backdrop, not backdrop. And when we try to reopen one of these images, we can see that the background is much darker and it gives a lot more focus to the content while still being able to peek a little bit into the background. So the next thing I want to do is whenever we have this modal open, we currently only can hit escape to actually escape it, or of course refresh the page, but that's not necessarily a great UX. What I want to happen is when I open one of these, I want to be able to have a little X at the top so that somebody can click the button to actually escape. So I'm going to head back into my dialog, and underneath this div element, I'm going to add my new button, where inside I'm going to add, first of all, a span with a class name of SR only to make sure that I have close in a screen reader readable way. But then I want to also add an icon, and I'm going to use an X, and the X I'm going to just use from Lucid icons, which I already have installed. Now, of course, that means I need to import my X from Lucid React. But on this icon, and you can certainly use just a raw SVG, you can even use an image, really whatever you want. It's just essentially showing an X, where I'm going to add a class name of width of 4 and height of 4 just to resize it. I already know what those sizes are going to be, but ultimately I just want that X to be the appropriate size. Now looking on the page, we can see that our button is rendering. It's not necessarily in the right spot, but before we move forward, let's add a little bit more styling to this. We're up on the button itself. First of all, I want that to be a BG Zinc 200, a background of zinc at the 200 shade. I want to make it rounded, full. I want to add some shadow to that. I also want to add it to make it a little bit bigger than the X itself. So I'm going to add width of 5, height of 5, and to make sure that it's centered within those bounds, let's add flex, items, center, and justify center. Now also to make sure that that X shows up in the appropriate color, I want to also add a text color to my X. So let's add this of text zinc 900, I think. And looking in the browser, I think that's looking a lot better, but now let's reposition that. And where we want this to actually be is in the top right corner of our little modal. So the first thing I'm going to do is on my dialog, I'm going to add the class name of relative so that I can position my button relative to that dialog. And then on the button itself, let's add absolute. How about top -2, or rather -2, minus right 2, so that we can go in the top right corner if you're looking at this. And the only other thing that we want to consider is the Z index here. We want to make sure that the button is always on top of our actual dialog content. So on our div, our inner div, I'm going to also set that to relative with a Z index of 0. So it's always on the base layer. And then I'm going to add a Z index of 1 on the actual button. And heading to the browser, we can see that our button did move up to this top right corner, but we have a little bit of an issue. It's now getting cut off by the dialog. Now, the way that we can fix this is back on the dialog element itself, we can add an overflow of visible, where if I head to the browser, we can see that that immediately fixed it. Now, trying to think for a second if that's going to have repercussions at all, because we're changing the default behavior of that overflow, my instinct tells me that it's probably there to help in situations where you don't want the modal to expand past the viewport. So if you have a ton of content, you probably want that to be scrollable, right? Where in our case, we're setting that value of the shape of the, or aspect ratio dynamically so that we can contain ourselves. So in our case, we don't really need that to be containing the scrollability because we don't want that scrollability. So I think for our case, we're probably fine setting that visible overflow so that we can now show that X button. But now let's actually make this button work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse down this class name so I can add an on click handler. And inside this, what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to trigger a close dialog function rather than just simply running the close method here. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to do two things, and I'm probably going to use that in other contexts. So let's define this close modal function where I'm going to now scroll back up and actually define this close modal function, and inside we can now access our dialog ref and do something similarly, but this time close our modal. And the only other thing that I want to do is I want to reset the state of my active image to make sure that I don't have any stale state that's going to create issues for opening other images in the future, or that same image in the future. So I'm going to then set an active image to undefined to clean things up. So back inside the browser, as soon as I click this X, it worked perfectly. And if I try that on another one, or one where you can actually see the X button, we can see that it's working perfectly. Now, another thing that you might have noticed as we've been playing around with this is if I open up my modal and scroll on the actual page, this shouldn't happen, right? I want it to be locked to the top of the page, or rather wherever the modal is being shown, which is the top of the page. So what we can do is we can prevent the body from being allowed to scroll by setting the overflow to hidden on that body element. Now, we don't have a simple class name that we can just add to the body because I don't think Tailwind would be able to add that class name and make it available. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use some JavaScript and set that CSS style manually. What we're going to do is after we show the modal, I'm going to add document body.style, where I'm going to set the overflow to hidden. And if I head to the browser and refresh, because we've got to make sure that that now invokes with the use effect, if I click on an image to open it, I can no longer actually scroll on that page. But if I now escape, I still can't scroll. So we need to make sure that we also remove that property. Now you might be thinking we can just simply add that to our close modal function. And while we can, we're currently only using that close modal function for when somebody hits the button to close, not hitting the escape key. So we're missing that completely other use case. But what we can do is we can listen for the close event on our dialog element, and then we can invoke that close function whenever that occurs to make sure that we do have that closed and cleaned up and ready to go. So what I'm going to do is on that same dialog ref element, I'm going to add event listener for the close event. And then inside, I'm going to pass in that close modal function. So that means whenever that close event triggers, or whenever the action of close occurs on dialog, we're now going to fire that function, which currently just closes and resets the state. But now we can add that same overflow definition where now we're going to get rid of the value. Now it's important to note here, we're getting rid of the value in this example, but if you have an overflow value set on your body, you want to make sure that you save that value so that you can reset it to the original value. Now we don't currently have an overflow set on the body. That's why we're able to just simply remove it. But now if I head back to the browser, open up the modal, I can see that I can't scroll. If I now hit escape and try to scroll again, we can see that I can perfectly scroll. Now, before we move on though, we always want to make sure that we clean up our event handlers like this. So we're going to add a return function to our use effect so that whenever this statement that caused the effect turns not true, or true the rather for that dependency, we can now clean it up where we're going to now remove event listener, which always needs to be that same function definition, where we can now remove that and clean it up. Now, one thing to quickly note is you might have noticed that we're doing this inside of the same use effect that has our active images as a dependency. If you think about it, traditionally you might use an effect with the no dependency in order to set your event listeners, but we really only need this event listener if we have an active image. So why not just save some browser resources and set it only if we have an active image, which is exactly what we do here. Now, everything seems to be working as expected. We have a pretty good looking modal and a model, might I add, and we have this close button that works perfectly. Now, what else can we do to kind of enhance the experience? Well, if we're inside of an image gallery, how about I want to be able to navigate all the different images without having to close the modal and open the next one? What if I hit the left and right arrow keys in order to go to the next image or the previous image? Now, because we're already storing our active image in state, we're already prepared for being able to dynamically render the image based off of different events. So that means we can now listen for keyboard events or on key down, so that whenever that triggers, if somebody hits the left or right arrow key, we can dynamically update it based off of where they are in that list of resources. So to start, I'm going to now create that keyboard event listener, and we can do that still inside that same use effect, because again, we only really need that if we have an active image. So why set it when we don't have an active image? So I'm going to now duplicate this add event listener line. I'm going to replace this with document.body, and now we're going to listen to the key down event. Now we also need to have a function associated with that. So now let's make that handle on key down. And now I can define that function. Let's add it below our close modal function. Now, as usual, we need to make sure that we clean that up. We remove that event listener from our event body or document body, and then update our key down for the actual event that we're listening to. But now this handle on key down function is going to fire every time that we hit a key whenever we have that active image. So let's log out that event. So we can type our event. It's going to be a keyboard event for TypeScript. Let's console log this out. But now if we head to the browser with an active image and we hit the arrow keys, we can see that we are getting those logs. And if we try to look at one of them, we can see that we are able to distinguish which one is the arrow right versus the arrow left. And we can see that we have two properties. We have the code and the key. I think we want to use the key for our use case, where if we look at MDN, it kind of goes into details about what you need to expect. Looks like code ignores users' keyboard layout. I don't know if that's actually relevant to us because they're the same values, but ultimately let's use the key property for this case. If you have a better explanation of when you use code versus key, let us know in the comments. But now let's actually use that. So I'm going to say if event.key equals arrow right, we're going to do something. Let's just console log out right for now. And I'm going to say else if event.key equals arrow left. Let's go ahead and console log out our left. And it works perfectly. So now ultimately what I want to do is I want to look at the full list of resources that I'm passing to this component, and I want to find out where our active images is in that list. I want to find its index so that once I have that index, I can say I want to find the one after it or the one before it and show that one. So I'm going to create a new constant called current index, and I'm going to set that equal to resources, and I'm going to use find index, where inside that, the property that I'm going to use is public ID. Now, this is going to probably depend on what you're using in your use case, where I'm using a cloudinary resource, which is going to have that public ID. So I'm going to say if my public ID equals my active image.public ID, that's going to be my right index. But if we notice we're getting some TypeScript errors, what we want to do is we want to make sure that resources actually exist just to keep TypeScript happy, or rather we want to make sure it doesn't exist actually. And of course, in our context, active image might be undefined. It likely won't be given we're doing this with an active image, but anyways, we can make sure that that is actually defined when we're doing that check. But now we have that current index, and let's console log that out now. So now let's open one of our images. Let's go to number 2, which is going to be a 1 in an array index. And let's now hit left and right. We can see that we do get that 1. And if we now exit out and we go to 0, we can see we get a 0. If we go to say, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we also get our 4. So now let's use that to determine what image to show next. Now, TypeScript's going to yell at me if I try to use current index before I'm trying to make sure that it's actually there. So the first thing I'm going to say is if type of current index equals undefined, I'm going to simply return. And why are we checking explicitly if it's undefined as opposed to just checking, like resources if it exists? The issue is current index might be 0, which is falsy. So that's going to trip it up if it tries to go through, and it'll return out, and that creates a bug for us. But now we have our current index. Let's actually try to use it. So the way that I'm going to do this is if we're trying to go the right way, I want to first make sure that we're not at the very end of our array of resources. So I'm going to say if the current index plus 1 is less than our resources.length, then we're ultimately going to set the next image. And what we're doing here is, if you remember, arrays are indexed by 0, where resources.length will give the 1, 2, 3, 4, or rather it'll start by 1. So that's why we add the 1 here when we're comparing that value. But now we're going to say the next image is going to be our current index plus 1, and we're going to access that on the actual array that we're currently working with. But now that we have that next image, let's now set active image, and that's going to be our next image. All right, so heading back to the browser to test this out. Let's see if I click on this first one, it should give me the zombie one. It did. It gave me that other one. We can see that I get this cube, and it's going to go ahead and keep going through those images properly as I have the next index. But if we noticed, I got to the very end here and it's not doing anything. So we need to add that else statement where if we are at the very end, we need to loop back to the start. So I'm going to simply add an else here, and I'm going to say my next image is going to be resources 0, which is going to be the very start. And then I can set the active image again as my next image. And scrolling down and selecting that last image again, if I now hit right, we can see we go back to the start, and I can keep going through. Once I get to the end, it goes back to the start again. But now let's actually implement the left arrow. Now, implementing the left arrow is a little bit simpler to think about, where we don't need to check the length of the array. We just know if we're at the position of 0 or not. So we're going to say if our current indexed does not equal 0, then we can do a similar thing that we're doing with our current index, but this time we're going to remove one. And giving this a try, if I click my zombie bull and hit left, we can see we go to the first image. But now, as expected, I'm stuck. So let's now loop back to the end of the array, where we can say else, where I'm going to grab my next image, but this time I'm going to actually do something similar where I do check the length, and I'm going to say I want it to be resources.length -1, again, to make sure that we're getting that 0 indexed value. And let's give that another try. If I'm on my zombie, I can go left and go to the very end of the array. If I hit right, I can come right back to the start. And now I have the wraparound navigation through all these different images. Now, there's some optimizations that you can do here for sure when adding that navigation, because if you go to the next image, it needs to load a second. Now, I have a loading indicator. My images were cached as I was showing it, so you can just get that loading screen. But you can also do things like preload the next image if you want, but we're not going to cover that here. Now, another thing that you might want to consider doing is we're only using the arrow navigation right now in order to allow people to navigate, but we could probably add little arrows to the side of here so that somebody can actually click right or left if they want to go to the next or previous image. And there's absolutely one more thing I want to do to this app. I want to make sure that this modal gets dismissed when I'm clicking outside of the content, instead of just requiring the escape key or clicking that button. So next up, let's see how we can listen for clicks outside of our content to dismiss that modal.